Racist operator ignores black child's call for help. What he did next changed everything. 911 operator ignores a boy's call. The shocking aftermath will leave you speechless. When help didn't come, a child's courage exposed deep injustice and sparked change. Watch the full story, subscribe, and join the conversation. Comment below. Where are you watching this from? The sky was already dimming as Daniel trudged home from school. His small frame weighed down by the heavy backpack stuffed with books looked even smaller under the growing shadows cast by the dilapidated buildings in his neighborhood. He clutched a plastic bag in his left hand filled with a few apples and a loaf of bread, items he had carefully picked out after school. Today had been a hard day, but then again most days in his part of the city were hard. The sound of distant traffic, occasional sirens, and the scattered conversations of people ing on the street corners blended into a background noise. He was so used to that he barely noticed it anymore. Daniel reached the rusty graffiti-covered door of his apartment building and let out a small sigh. This was home, an aging 3-story complex with crumbling brick walls and a broken security gate that never locked properly. The elevator had been out of service for as long as he could remember, and the narrow stairway always smelled faintly of damp and mildew, but it was home, and waiting inside was the one person who made it bearable: his mom. Climbing the stairs to their second-floor apartment, Daniel's thoughts wandered to her. She had been feeling unwell for a few days now, more tired than usual. She was carrying his baby brother or sister, and even though she tried to hide it, Daniel noticed how much it was wearing on her. Every time she groaned quietly or rubbed her swollen belly with a tired hand, it felt like a heavy stone settled in his chest. He was excited about having a sibling, but he hated seeing his mom struggle. As he reached their apartment door, Daniel's stomach tightened. The door was ajar. That wasn't right. His mom always kept locked, especially in this neighborhood. He pushed it open slowly, his heart thawing in his chest, and stepped inside. The sight that met him froze him in place. His mom was lying on the kitchen floor, motionless. "Mom," he called out, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. The plastic bag slipped from his hand, apples rolling across the floor. But Daniel didn't care. His breath hitched, and his legs felt like they had turned to jelly. Everything around him blurred except for the image of his mother crumpled on the floor, her face pale, eyes closed. "Mom," he shouted, this time louder, as if raising his voice could somehow wake her. But still she didn't move. Daniel's heart raced, his mind scrambling for what to do. He took a shaky step forward, then another, until he was kneeling beside her. Her face was clammy, her breathing shallow and uneven. He reached for her hand, which was cold to the touch. Panic surged through him. The smell of something burning suddenly hit his nose. The stove. He shot up, glancing at the stove where a pot of soup had boiled over, steam rising from the stove top, the liquid sizzling against the burner. Daniel rushed over and turned it off, his hands trembling. The last thing they needed was a fire. His eyes darted back to his mom. She was still unconscious. Daniel's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? He had to call for help. He sprinted to the counter where his mom kept her cell phone, but it wasn't there. Frantically, he searched the kitchen, tossing aside dish towels and old bills scattered on the counter. Then he remembered his mom's phone was charging in the bedroom. Heart pounding, he ran to the small bedroom they shared, grabbed the phone, and quickly dialed 911. He held the phone to his ear, pacing back and forth as the ringing seemed to stretch on forever. 911, what's your emergency? Came a voice, calm and detached. Daniel's words stumbled out in a rush. It's my mom. She's unconscious. She's pregnant. And I don't know what to do. Please, I need help. There was a brief pause on the other end. What's your location, sweetie? We're at 2312 Brownstone Avenue, apartment 204, Daniel said, his voice shaking. Please hurry. Another pause. This one longer. Daniel, you said 2312 Brownstone. That's in the east side, right? Daniel nodded frantically, even though the woman on the phone couldn't see him. Yes, please, we need help. The woman's tone shifted slightly, becoming colder. And your mother, does she use any substances? Is there any history of drugs in the house? Daniel blinked, confused. No, she's just sick. Please, she needs help. The operator sighed audibly. Honey, I'm going to be honest with you. Calls from that area usually take a while to get to. Our units are spread pretty thin, and we prioritize the most urgent cases. Daniel's chest tightened. But this is urgent. She's not breathing right, and she's pregnant. Please, I need someone to come now. A brief silence followed, and then the woman spoke again, her voice almost condescending. Look, in places like that, people need to learn how to handle things themselves. We'll get someone there when we can just hold on. Daniel's mind reeled. Did she just say places like that? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His stomach churned with fear and anger. But my mom, she's dying. Please. The line went dead. I just stared at the phone, his hands shaking. How could she hang up? How could they leave his mom like this? His throat tightened, tears burning in his eyes. But he forced them back. He didn't have time to cry. He had to do something. He knelt beside his mother. again gently placing his hand on her forehead. She was still cold, her breathing was faint, but there he remembered a lesson they had at school about first aid, about checking for breathing, and keeping in the airway open. His teacher had told them about recovery positions, how to help someone who had fainted. His hands moved on autopilot, shifting his mother into a safer position, making sure her head was tilted slightly back so she could breathe more easily. His mind raced. What else can I do? He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He had to try again. Without another thought, Daniel ran out of the apartment and started knocking on doors. Please help my mom. She's unconscious, and they won't send anyone. His voice cracked with desperation. The first door didn't open, neither did the second. But at the third, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a scarf wrapped around her head peeked out. Her name was Miss G, a neighbor who often smiled at him when she pass by. What's wrong, baby? She asked her voice soft but worried. It's my mom, Daniel gasped. She's passed out, and they won't send help. Please, can you call Miss Jeannie's face tightened with concern. Of course, I'll call right now. Daniel followed her into her apartment, where she picked up her old landline phone and dialed 911. He listened as she explained the situation calmly, but he could hear the frustration creeping into her voice as the operator gave her the same response. Miss G hung up, shaking her head. They said the same thing. It'll be a while. Daniel's heart sank further. What am I supposed to do? Miss G put a hand on his shoulder. Stay with her, baby. Don't leave her side. I'm going to try to get more help. Daniel nodded, swallowing back the tears threatening to spill. He turned and ran back to his apartment, his mind whirling with fear. Time was slipping away, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Daniel sat by his mother's side, holding her cold hand in his trembling fingers. The minutes dragged on like hours, and every breath she took seemed shallower than the last. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Every tick of the clock on the wall echoed in his ears like a reminder that time was running out. He stared at her, face pale and motionless, trying to remember everything his teacher had said during the first aid class. He had never imagined he would need to use it like this. He was only 8. How was he supposed to handle this all by himself? The thought of losing her, the one person who had always been there for him, who had always protected him, was more than he could bear. He wanted to cry, to scream, but he knew that wouldn't help. He had to stay calm. He had to think. He looked around the small apartment, hoping for some kind of inspiration, but everything felt distant, like it was fading away. Suddenly, he remembered the burning pot on the stove. He had turned off the stove earlier, but what if something had already caught fire? What if the apartment was filling with smoke? He shot up and rushed back into the kitchen, frantically checking the stove and the surrounding area. Relief washed over him when he saw that everything was still intact. No fire, no smoke, but the air still felt heavy, thick with tension and fear. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he leaned against the counter, trying to collect himself. He couldn't lose his mother, not like this, not because of someone else's indifference. He needed to think of another way. His mind flashed back to the phone call with the 911 operator, her voice cold and dismissive, replayed in his head in places like that. People need to learn how to handle things themselves. The memory of her words sent a surge of anger through him. How could someone be so heartless? His mother wasn't just someone from a bad neighborhood. She was everything to him, and now she needed help, real help. He grabbed the phone again, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. More time, his heart pounding in his ears as it rang. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end sounded different this time, but the tone was the same, distant and mechanical. It's my mom. She's still unconscious. Please, we need help right now. Daniel's voice cracked, the desperation clear in every word. The operator sighed, as if annoyed by his persistence. We've already received a call from that address, and as I told you earlier, we'll send someone when a unit becomes available. There's no need to keep calling, but she's not breathing, right? And she's pregnant. Daniel pleaded. You said it would be a while, but I don't know how long she can last. There was a pause on the other end, and for a brief second Daniel thought he might have finally gotten through, true to her, but then she spoke again, and her words crushed any hope he had. Look, honey, like I said before, we're stretched thin tonight. If you can't wait, then I suggest you try calling a family member or a neighbor to help. Otherwise, just keep an eye on her until help arrives. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone in disbelief, his grip tightened around the device as anger and helplessness swirled inside him. How could they do this? How could they just ignore him? He threw the phone onto the couch, his hands trembling. He felt the walls of the small apartment closing in on him, suffocating him with their silence. The weight of everything was too much. His mom, the baby, the fact that no one cared enough to come and help. He was just a kid. How could he possibly handle all of this? But then He remembered something his mom had always told him: "You're stronger than you think, Daniel. You can handle more than you know." Those words echoed in his mind, and he clung to them now like a lifeline. He couldn't afford to give up, not now, not when his mom needed him the most. He wiped his eyes, forcing back the tears he couldn't afford to cry right now. He needed to think clearly to figure out what to do next. Daniel knelt back down next to his mother gently, placing his hand on her chest to feel for her. Breathing, it was faint, but it was still there. He needed to keep her stable until help arrived. Whenever it arrived, his mind replayed the basic first aid steps he had learned at school. He remembered hearing about the recovery position and how it could help someone who was unconscious breathe better. He gently turned his mother onto her side, supporting her head as he positioned her body in the recovery position. Her breathing didn't improve much, but at least she wasn't lying flat on her back anymore. It was something. He stood up, glancing around the room. He needed more help. He couldn't do this alone. His first instinct was to go back to Miss Jeannie's apartment and ask her to call again, but he hesitated. She had already tried, and it hadn't worked. The operators didn't care. Instead, Daniel decided to try another neighbor. He thought of Mr. Thompson, who lived at the end of the hall. He was an older man, retired, but he had always been kind to Daniel and his mom. Maybe he could help. Daniel bolted out of the apartment and ran down the dimly lit hallway, his shoes slapping against the worn carpet. He reached Mr. Thompson's door and knocked frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, and the familiar face of Mr. Thompson appeared, his brow furrowed with concern as he saw the panic in Daniel's eyes. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice calm but laced with worry. "It's my mom," Daniel gasped, trying to catch his breath. "She's passed out, and they won't send anyone." "Please, I don't know what to do." Mr. Thompson's face tightened, and he nodded quickly. All right, let me get my phone. We'll try again." Daniel followed him inside, pacing anxiously as Mr. Thompson picked up his old flip phone and dialed 911. Daniel listened, intently, hoping, praying that maybe this time someone would actually do something. But as Mr. Thompson explained the situation, Daniel's heart sank. The conversation was almost identical to the one he had just had. "They said the same thing," Mr. Thompson said grimly as he hung up the phone. "They'll come when they can, but they're not in any hurry." Daniel clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. "But she needs help now." "I know, son," Mr. Thompson said, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "But we're not going to sit around and do nothing. Let's see if we can't get her to the hospital ourselves. Maybe we can before Mr. Thompson's son could finish." The sound of shuffling feet and murmured voices filled the hallway. Daniel and Mr. Thompson turned toward the door as several of their neighbors appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" Mrs. Johnson, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, asked. "Is everything all right?" Daniel shook his head. "It's my mom. She's unconscious, and the ambulance won't come." Mrs. Johnson's face softened with sympathy, and she stepped forward. "Let me try calling too. Maybe if enough of us call, they'll send someone faster." Daniel nodded gratefully as more of the neighbors gathered around, offering their support. Mrs. Johnson pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady as she explained the situation, but when she hung up, her expression was grim. "They told me the same thing," she said, shaking her head. Daniel's heart sank even further. It felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, or no matter how hard he tried, nothing would change. His mom was lying unconscious in their apartment, and the people who were supposed to help them didn't care. They were just another poor family in a bad neighborhood, nothing worth rushing for. But as Daniel stood there surrounded by his neighbors, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. He might be just a kid, but he had people around him who cared, people who were willing to fight with him. The world outside their small apartment seemed to move on as usual, while inside Daniel's world was crumbling. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, an indifferent reminder of how much time had already passed. His mother still hadn't woken up, and despite the small crowd of concerned neighbors now gathered around, there was no sign of real help on the way. The weight of responsibility pressed harder on Daniel's shoulders. With every second he stood in the middle of the room, watching as Miss G and Mr. Thompson whispered each other, trying to come up with ideas. Mrs. Johnson was pacing back and forth, her cell phone pressed against her ear, making yet another call to the emergency service. But Daniel knew what the answer would be before she even spoke, the same cold, distant response they had been hearing for the past hour. "They still won't come," Mrs. Johnson finally said, shaking her head as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. "It's always the same with this part of town. They just don't care." Mr. Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's disgraceful is what it is, but standing around here isn't going to do any good. We need to get her to the hospital ourselves." "But how?" Miss G asked, her voice full of concern. "She's too weak to move, and none of us have a car." Daniel bit his lip, feeling more helpless than ever. The adults were talking, but they weren't coming up with any real solutions. Time was slipping through his fingers, and his mom was still lying on the floor, breathing shallowly, her skin pale. Every instinct inside him screamed that he had to do something, anything. He couldn't wait any longer. Suddenly, an idea struck him. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than waiting around for help that might never come. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. "I have an idea," he said, stepping forward. The group of neighbors turned to look at him, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. He felt their eyes on him, but he forced himself to stand tall. He was just a kid, but right now he was the only one who could make a difference. "What's your idea, Daniel?" Mr. Thompson asked gently, his eyes soft with understanding. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to put his plan into words. "I'm going to call 911 again, but this time I'll lie about where we are. I'll tell them we're in a different neighborhood, one where they'll come faster." A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. Mrs. Johnson shook her head, her eyes wide. "Daniel, honey, you can't lie to them. That could get you in trouble." But Daniel was already shaking his head. "They're not coming anyway. If I tell them we're somewhere else, somewhere they care about, they'll send help. And when they figure out the truth, it'll be too late. They'll already be here." The adults exchanged worried glances, but no one argued. They all knew he was right. The system was broken, and if Daniel didn't take Dr. IC action, his mom might not make it. Desperation pushed him forward. Miss G finally nodded, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's risky, but we don't have many options left. Just be careful, Daniel." Daniel didn't waste any more time. He grabbed the phone from the couch and walked into the hallway, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed 911. Once more, his heart pounded in his chest, the familiar sound of ringing filling his ears as he waited for the operator to pick up. 911, what's your emergency? This time the voice on the other end was a man's, calm, professional, but distant, just like the others had been. Daniel took a deep breath, steady in his voice. "It's my mom," he said, forcing his tone to stay calm. "She's unconscious, and she's pregnant. Please, we need an ambulance right away." "All right, where are you located?" the operator asked, his tone neutral. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was the moment of truth. "We're at 425 Oakwood Avenue, apartment 3B, he said, naming a street in a wealthier part of town, one where he knew the emergency services responded quickly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. "All right, we'll dispatch an ambulance to that location. Stay on the line." Relief surged through him. It had worked. They were sending someone, but the feeling of victory was short-lived. "Wait a minute," the operator said suddenly, his tone sharpening. "Are you sure you're at that address, son?" Daniel froze, panic rising in his throat. Yeah, he stammered. "Why, we're running a check on the location. There's no record of a phone call coming from that address. Are you sure you're not calling from somewhere else?" Daniel's mind raced. They were onto him. He had to think fast, or they would hang up again, and he'd be back at square one. His heart pounded as he tried to come up with a convincing lie, but his voice faltered under the pressure. I
don't know," he said,
his voice trembling. "I'm just a kid. I don't know the address exactly." The operator's tone hardened. "Son, we need you to be honest with us. If you're calling from a different location, we need to know." Daniel felt his stomach twist with fear. He had been so close to getting the help his mom needed, but now it was slipping away again, and he didn't know how to stop it. "Look, we'll send someone when we have a unit available," the operator said, his voice cold. "But don't play games with us. Line won't get you anywhere." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone in his hand, his body shaken with a mix of frustration, fear, and hopelessness. His plan had failed. They weren't coming, and his mom was still lying there, getting weaker with every passing minute. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had tried so hard. He had done everything he could think of, but it still wasn't enough. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to save her when no one else would help? Tears stung the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't break down, not now, not when his mom needed him to be strong. Daniel walked back into the apartment, his heart heavy. The neighbors looked at him expectantly, but the expression on his face told them everything they needed to know. "They're not coming," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The disappointment in the room was palpable. Miss G shook her head sadly, and Mr. Thompson let out a long, frustrated sigh, but none of them said anything. There was nothing left to say. Daniel walked back over to his mom, kneeling down beside her. He took her hand and is feeling the coolness of her skin against his fingers. She still hadn't woken up, and her breathing was even more shallow than before. He squeezed her hand, gently leaning close to her. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm trying so hard," but no matter how hard he tried, it felt like the whole world was against him. The System didn't care about people like them, people who lived in rundown apartments and forgotten parts of the city. To the outside world, they were invisible, and in that moment, Daniel felt invisible too. But as he sat there holding his mother's hand, something shifted inside him. He had felt invisible his whole life, overlooked, underestimated, ignored. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He wasn't going to let the system beat him. His mom had always told him that he was stronger than he knew, and he was starting to believe her. He wheat his eyes, standing up straight. He wasn't done fighting, not yet. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by concerned faces, his mind racing. He had done everything he could think of, called the emergency services, tried to trick them into coming faster, even enlisted the help of his neighbors. But none of it had worked. His mom was still unconscious, lying on the cold floor, her breathing faint. Time was running out. The small crowd of neighbors that had gathered in the cramped apartment was growing restless. They whispered among themselves, casting worried glances at Daniel and his mom. Mrs. Johnson was pacing back and forth, her brow furrowed with frustration. Mr. Thompson stood with his arms crossed, deep in thought. Miss Jean sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He was just a kid. What else could he do? But then he remembered something his mom had always told him: you don't always have to do everything by yourself. Sometimes it's okay to ask for help. Those words echoed in his mind, and for the first time that night he realized that he wasn't alone. His neighbors were here, and they wanted to help. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "We can't wait any longer," he said, his voice firm but shaky. "We need to find another way to get my mom to the hospital." The room fell silent as the neighbors turned to look at him. For a moment no one spoke. Then Mr. Thompson stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "You're right, Daniel," he said, his voice calm but serious. "We can't just sit around and hope the ambulance shows up. We've got to take action." "But how?" Miss G asked, her voice tinged with worry. "None of us have a car, and moving her without proper help could be dangerous." Mr. Thompson scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I've got some friends at the local hospital. They might be able to send someone if we can't get the city to respond." "Let me try calling them." Daniel nodded, his heart lifting slightly. Maybe Mr. Thompson's connections would work. Maybe, just maybe, they could get the help they needed without relying on the broken emergency services system. As Mr. Thompson pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway to make the call, the other neighbors began murmuring among themselves again. Some looked worried, others frustrated. Daniel could see that they were scared just like he was, but he couldn't let that fear stop him. Suddenly Miss G spoke up. "We should record this." Everyone turned to look at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Johnson asked. Miss G stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in her skirt. "We should record what's happening, how the emergency services are refusing to help, how we're being ignored. If we can get it on video, maybe we can show people what's really going on. Maybe then someone will pay attention." Daniel's eyes widened. It was a bold idea, but it made sense. If the authorities wouldn't help them, maybe public pressure would force them to act. People had to see the injustice, how his mom was being left to suffer just because they lived in a poor neighborhood. He knew that people cared about these things when they were shown the truth that might actually work. Daniel said, his voice filled with a newfound sense of hope. "If people see how they're ignoring us, they won't be able to just look the other way." Mrs. Johnson nodded, already pulling out her smartphone. "I'll start recording right now." The neighbor began to spring into action. Mrs. Johnson started recording a video explaining the situation into the camera, how Daniel's mother had been unconscious for nearly an hour, how multiple calls to 911 had been ignored or dismissed, and how they were being left to fend for themselves because of where they lived. Daniel watched as she filmed the room, capturing the worried faces of the neighbors and the sight of his mother lying motionless on the floor. It felt strange to have something so personal being documented, but he understood why it was necessary. This wasn't just about his mom anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been ignored or mistreated because of where they lived, the color of their skin, or how much money they had. This was about showing the world the truth. As Mrs. Johnson finished her recording, Daniel felt a surge of determination. "I'm going to stay with my mom," he said, moving back to her side and kneeling beside her. "But we need to make sure that video gets out. People need to see it. I'll post it online," Mrs. Johnson said, already typing on her phone. "I've got some connections with local activists. They can help spread the word." Daniel nodded, grateful for her quick thinking. He didn't fully understand how social media worked, but he had seen enough to know that once something went viral, it was hard to ignore. If enough people saw the video, maybe they could force the city to take action. Maybe they could finally get the help his mom needed. As Mrs. Johnson worked on uploading the video, Mr. Thompson turned from the hallway Looking grim, they said they'd tread to send someone, but it could take a while, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. They're swamped tonight too, and they don't have many people to spare. Daniel's heart sank again, but he didn't let the despair consume him. They weren't out of options, yet the video was their best chance. Now the next hour felt like a blur. More neighbors began arriving, drawn by the commotion. Some offered words of encouragement while others tried to help however they could. One woman brought blankets to cover Daniel's mom, while another offered water. Daniel stayed by his mother's side the entire time, holding her hand and watching her chest rise and fall with every shallow breath. He was scared, terrified, really, but he couldn't show it. He had to be strong for her. Suddenly, the sound of Daniel's phone buzzing jolted him from his thoughts. Mrs. Johnson looked up from her own phone, her eyes wide with surprise. "Daniel," she said, her voice urgent. "The video, it's already spreading. People are sharing it all over social media." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Really?" "Yeah," Mrs. Johnson continued, scrolling through her phone. "People are tagging the city, the news outlets, everyone. There's even talk of organizing a protest if nothing's done soon." The neighbors murmured in surprise, the energy in the room shifting from despair to cautious hope. Daniel couldn't believe it. The video had only been up for an hour, but already people were taken notice. "They can't ignore us now," Mr. Thompson said, a glimmer of hope in his voice. Daniel felt a small flicker of hope spark inside him. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the turning point. But as the minutes continued to tick by and no help arrived, that hope began to waver. Daniel glanced down at his mom again. Her breathing was still shallow, her skin still pale. He squeezed her hand, gently willing her to hold on just a little longer. "They're coming, Mom," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. "Just hold on a little longer." Suddenly, there was movement outside the apartment. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by voices. Daniel's heart raced. Could it be? Had the video worked? The front door opened, and a group of paramedics rushed into the room, their faces serious and focused. Behind them were two police officers, their expressions unreadable. Daniel's heart surged with relief. Finally, help had arrived. Finally, his mom would get the care she needed. But as the paramedics began to assess his mom, Daniel noticed something strange. The police officers were standing off to the side, watching everything closely. One of them, a tall, stern-looking man with a square jaw, seemed to be scanning the room with suspicion. Daniel frowned, a sense of relief quickly giving way to unease. Something wasn't right. Why were the police here? They hadn't called the police. They had called an ambulance. The paramedics continued their work, checking Daniel's mom's vital and preparing her for transport, but the police officers remained watching from the sidelines. Then the tall officer stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "What happened here?" he asked, looking directly at Daniel. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. She passed out," he stammered. "She's pregnant, and she wasn't feeling well. I called for help." The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with the answer. "And there's nothing else going on here? No drugs, no alcohol?" Daniel's stomach twisted in disgusted. "No," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "She's not on drugs. She's sick." The officer looked around the room, his expression hard. "We'll see about that." The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows on the walls of the cramped apartment as the paramedics continued to work over Daniel's mom. Their movements were quick and efficient, but to Daniel it felt like everything was happening in slow motion. His heart pounded in his chest, his stomach knotted with a mix of relief and dread. Help had finally come, but something didn't feel right. The presence of the police officers with their hard, suspicious gazes hung over the room like a dark cloud. Daniel watched anxiously as one of the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over his mother's face. Her chest rose and fell slowly, and though she was still unconscious, her breathing seemed steadier now. But the relief he had hoped for didn't come. His attention kept drifting to the two officers standing by the door. They weren't here to help, they were here to judge, to make assumptions, to find a reason not to care. The taller officer, the one who had questioned Daniel earlier, stepped forward again, his arms crossed over his chest. His cold eyes swept over the room, lingering on the worn furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the cracks in the ceiling. Daniel could feel the weight of his judgment in every glance. "What's really going on here?" the officer asked, his voice low and accusing. "This doesn't look like just a medical emergency." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? He had already told them what had happened. His mom had passed out, and they needed help, but it was clear from the officer's tone that he didn't believe a word of it. "We told you," Mr. Thompson interjected, his voice calm but firm. "The boy's mother's pregnant, and she's been unwell for days. She collapsed, and no one was coming to help. That's all there is to it." The officer snorted, his eyes narrowing. "Funny how that story is always the same in places like this," he muttered under his breath. but loud enough for everyone to hear. Collapsed, sick, needing help. Next thing we know, we're finding drugs or booze in the mix. Daniel clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. How could they think that? How could they look at his mom lying there unconscious and still think she was just another addict or criminal? He wanted to shout to tell them they were wrong, but his throat felt tight, and the words wouldn't come out. Mrs. Johnson, standing nearby, crossed her arms. You've got a lot of nerve. Officer, she said, her voice sharp. This woman is sick, and her son has been trying to get help for hours. Instead of throwing around accusations, maybe you should be focusing on getting her to the hospital. The officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the shorter, younger officer beside him spoke up, his tone slightly more measured. We're just doing our job, ma'am, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We've seen a lot of things in neighborhoods like this, and sometimes it's not what it seems. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. They were supposed to protect people, to help them when they were in trouble, but instead they were treating his mom like a criminal, like she didn't deserve to be saved. She's not like that, Daniel blurted out, his voice shaking with emotion. My mom's not on drugs. She's not drinking. She's a good person. She's just sick. Please just help her. The paramedics continued their work in the background, but the tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Daniel could feel the judgment in every glance the officers cast around the apartment. To them, this was just another case of a poor black family in a rundown part of town, nothing worth taking seriously. The taller officer stepped closer to Daniel, towering over him. His eyes were cold, calculating. You sure about that, kid? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. You really expect us to believe there's nothing else going on here? No drugs, no trouble? Daniel's stomach churned. How could they be so heartless? His mother was lying there, barely breathing, and all they could think about was trying to prove that they were guilty of something. We're not lying, Daniel said, his voice trembling but resolute. We've been waiting for help all night, and no one came. My mom is sick, and she's pregnant. That's all there is to it. The officer didn't respond, but his expression made it clear that he didn't believe Daniel. He looked like he was about to say something else when one of the paramedics stood up from where he had been kneeling beside Daniel's mom. We need to move her to the ambulance now, the paramedic said, his tone professional but tense. Her condition is critical. We can't wait any longer. The officers exchanged glances, but finally they seemed to back off. Daniel let out a breath. He didn't realize he had been holding the paramedics. Quickly and carefully lifted his mother onto a stretcher, securing her with straps and preparing her for transport. As they moved her toward the door, Daniel hurried after them, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and fear. She was finally going to the hospital, but he knew this wasn't the end. His mom still wasn't out of danger, and those police officers, they weren't done with them yet. As the paramedics pushed the stretcher out of the apartment, the taller officer stopped Daniel at the door, blocking his path. You coming with us, kid? He asked, his voice flat. Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, I have to go with her. The officer stared at him for a moment, then stepped aside. But just as Daniel was about to follow the paramedics out the door, the officer leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. Don't think we're done here, he said quietly. We'll be checking up on this situation, and if we find out you've been lying about anything, well, you won't like the consequences. Daniel's stomach twisted in knots, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded and hurried after his mother, the officer's warning echoing in his ears. As they made their way down the narrow hallway and out into the street, the cool night air hit Daniel's face, offering a brief moment of clarity. The paramedics loaded his mom into the back of the ambulance, and one of them gestured for Daniel to climb in. We'll take care of her, the paramedic said, his voice softer than before. You did good, kid. Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he climbed into the ambulance and sat beside his mother. As the doors closed behind him and the siren blared to life, the ambulance sped off into the night. But even as they raced toward the hospital, Daniel couldn't shake the fear that still gripped him. The officer's words haunted him, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on his chest like a boulder. He looked down at his mom, her face pale and still beneath the oxygen mask. She was alive, but she wasn't safe yet. They had gotten her to the hospital, but the fight wasn't over. Daniel knew that they would have to keep fighting for her, for justice, for everything the system had tried to deny them. As the city lights blurred past the windows of the speed and ambulance, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to protect his mom, to get her the care she deserved, no matter what the police thought, no matter how many obstacles they faced. He wouldn't give up. The cold, sterile lights of the hospital flickered above Daniel as he sat by his mother's bedside. It had been hours since they arrived, and every second felt like an eternity. Nurses moved quickly through the Hall's checking charts, adjusting 4 lines, and ensuring his mom was stable. She still hadn't woken up, but her breathing was more regular now. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping Daniel from falling apart. He held her hand, tightly, afraid that if he let go something terrible might happen, but as much as he wanted to stay in the safety of the hospital room, the weight of everything that had happened kept pressing down on him. The paramedics, the police, the operator, none of them had treated his mom like she mattered. And now, sitting here in the quiet hospital room, Daniel knew he couldn't let it end there. A faint knock on the door broke the silence. Daniel looked up to see Mrs. Johnson peeking her head inside, holding her phone in her hand. She gave him a soft smile and stepped into the room. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently. "I just wanted to check on you. How's your mom?" Daniel shrugged, his voice small. "The doctor said she's stable, but she still hasn't woken up." Mrs. Johnson sat down in the chair beside him, her expression serious. "She's in good hands now, and I know she's going to pull through." Daniel wanted to believe her, but the fear gnawed at him. He gave her a small nod, but his mind was already drifting back to everything that had happened before they got here. Mrs. Johnson glanced at her phone and leaned in closer. "Daniel, I've got something to tell you. The video we posted, it's spreading fast. People are angry about what happened to your mom." "Real angry?" Daniel blinked, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes glinting with determination. "I mean, the whole city knows what happened now. That 911 operator's words, the way the police treated you, it's all out there, and people aren't happy. There are already calls for an investigation." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things were finally changing. They're starting protests. "Daniel," Mrs. Johnson continued, "activists are demanding accountability from the emergency services. They want answers. Why the ambulance took so long, why the police came to judge instead of help." Daniel's thoughts whirled. It felt surreal knowing that the world outside the hospital room had taken notice. It wasn't just him and his neighbors fighting now. People he didn't even know were standing up for them, demanding justice. Just then the door swung open and Mr. Thompson entered, his expression grim but purposeful. "Daniel," he said, "you've done something important, son. There's a lot of pressure on the city right now. They're opening an investigation into the 911 operator and the paramedics." "An investigation?" Daniel echoed, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Thompson nodded. "That's right, and they've already put that operator on leave. Same with those police officers until the investigation is over. They're off the streets." Daniel sat up straight, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief, anger, pride. It was all there, tangled together. He had felt so powerless just hours ago, but now things were changing. They weren't being ignored anymore. Mrs. Johnson leaned over, her voice soft but full of encouragement. "This happened because of you, Daniel. You fought for your mom when no one else would, and because of that, things are finally moving." Daniel stared down at his mom's hand in his. He had been so scared, so lost, but he had done it. He had fought for her, and people were listening. "Do you think they'll really change things?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice filled with a mix of hope and doubt. Mrs. Johnson exchanged a glance with Mr. Thompson, then gave Daniel a reassuring smile. "I think they'll have to. People won't let this go." The sound of a notification buzzing on Mrs. Johnson's phone pulled her attention away for a moment. She glanced down at the screen and gasped softly, "Daniel, look." She turned the phone toward him, and Daniel's eyes widened as he saw the video they had posted earlier. It had been shared thousands of times, and the comments were filled with messages of support, outrage, and demands for change. News outlets had picked up the story, and people from all over the country were speaking out, calling for justice. Daniel's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The world had listened, they had been heard, but before he could say anything, the door opened again, and a man in a suit stepped inside. His expression was stern but not unkind, and Daniel recognized him immediately. It was one of the city officials, someone important. "Mr. Thompson." "Mrs. Johnson," the man greeted with a nod, then turned to Daniel. "You must be Daniel. I wanted to come by personally to let you know that we've launched a formal investigation into what happened, and I want to apologize on behalf of the city for the way you and your mother were treated." Daniel stared at the man, his heart pounding. An apology, it wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. The man continued, "We'll be reviewing the protocols for emergency services to ensure something like this never happens again. The operator and paramedics involved will be held accountable, and the police officers will face disciplinary action. Daniel swallowed hard his emotions, threatening to overwhelm him. He had fought so hard, and now, finally, someone was taking responsibility. We're also working with local activists to allocate more resources to neighborhoods like yours, the man added. It's long overdue, but we're committed to making things right. Daniel nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. It felt like a dream, one he had never imagined would come true. The man gave him a small, encouraging smile. Your courage made this possible, Daniel. Don't forget that. As the official left the room, Daniel sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Johnson gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. See, I told you things were changing. Daniel looked down at his mom again, her hand warm in his. She was still unconscious, but he knew she was going to be okay, and not just her. Things were going to be okay for a lot of people, thanks to what they had done for the first time in a long while. Daniel felt something he hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the hospital room windows, casting soft golden rays across Daniel's mother as she stirred for the first time in days. Daniel sat at her bedside, his small hand still wrapped around hers, unwilling to let go. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady, a comforting reminder that she was alive and finally getting better. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. Daniel leaned closer, a mix of joy and relief washing over him. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. You're awake. She turned her head toward him, her lips curling into a faint smile despite her exhaustion. Hey, baby, she murmured, her voice weak but full of love. I'm here. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he squeezed her hand gently. I was so scared, he whispered. I thought I lost you. His mother's tired eyes softened as she brushed her fingers through his hair. I know, sweetheart, but you didn't give up on me, did you? Daniel shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. No, I didn't, and a lot of people didn't give up either. Just as he finished speaking, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Thompson, and Miss G entered the room with smiles on their faces. There's our brave boy, Mrs. Johnson said warmly, and look who's awake. Daniel's mom gave them a grateful, if tired, smile. Thank you for being here, for helping Daniel. Miss G waved a dismissive hand, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Oh, honey, you've got a remarkable boy here. We just followed his lead, Mr. Thompson chuckled, patting Daniel on the shoulder. He's the reason things are changing around here. Daniel's mother looked at her son with a mixture of pride and amazement. What do you mean, baby? What happened? Daniel shifted in his seat, still overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded. We had to fight, Mom. The ambulance wasn't coming. The operator didn't care, so we recorded everything, and people, so many people, they saw it. They demanded change. Mrs. Johnson nodded, her face bright with excitement. The video went viral. It spread all over the internet, and the whole city got involved. The operator was suspended, and the paramedics are under investigation. They're even making the police officers take bias training. His mother's tired face lit up with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. They really listened. They did, Mr. Thompson said with a proud smile. And not just that. Activists are pushing for new policies and emergency services. The city promised to add more ambulances to neighborhoods like ours and ensure no one else gets treated the way you did. Tears filled her eyes, and she pulled Daniel into a weak but heartfelt hug. You did all that, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Daniel hugged her tightly, resting his head on her shoulder. We all did, Mom. I just didn't give up. The room was filled with a warm silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle as the neighbors shared in the moment. It wasn't just a victory for Daniel and his mom, it was a victory for their entire community, a step toward making sure no one else would ever be ignored like they had been. The following weeks brought more changes than Daniel could have imagined. The investigation into the 911 operator revealed systemic issues leading to several reforms. Emergency response teams were restructured, and new guidelines ensured that no calls would be ignored based on neighborhood or income. Local activists organized rallies, and Daniel's story became a symbol of the power of community. News outlets interviewed him and his mom, highlighting how a young boy's determination had sparked a movement. People from all over the city sent messages of support, and many joined the protests, demanding accountability from the authorities. The police officers involved in the incident were ordered to attend bias training, and one of them, a younger officer who had seemed hesitant that night, publicly apologized to A and his mom. While it didn't erase the hurt, it was a step toward healing. The city also allocated more resources to their neighborhood, improving medical services and access to emergency care. A new ambulance station was set up nearby, ensuring faster response times in the future. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. On a warm, sunny afternoon, Daniel and his mom finally got the chance to do something they hadn't done in a long time. They went to the park. The air was filled with the sound of children's laughter and the smell of fresh cut grass. Drifted on the breeze, Daniel's mom, still recovering but stronger each day, sat on a bench watching her son play on the swings. Daniel pumped his legs, soaring higher and higher, the sun warm in his face. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt light, free. The fear and uncertainty that had weighed on him were gone, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and hope. His mom watched him with a content smile, her heart swelling with pride. "You were my hero, Daniel," she whispered to herself, knowing that her son had shown more courage than most adults ever would. Daniel jumped off the swing, landing gracefully on the grass, and ran over to her mom. "Did you see how high I went?" he asked, beaming with excitement. "I saw a baby," she said, pulling him into a warm hug. "And I'm so proud of you. You didn't just fly high on that swing, you made the whole world listen." Daniel grinned, wrapping his arms around her. For the first time in a long, long time, everything felt right. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living, and the future felt brighter than ever. And as the two of them sat together on the park bench, enjoying the sunshine and each other's company, Daniel knew one thing for certain: no matter how hard life got, no matter how many obstacles stood in their way, they would always have each other, and together they could face anything. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more powerful content coming your way, and keep the conversation going. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching this from. Don't stop here. Click on the next video to discover more stories that matter and challenge perspectives. Your support helps us bring these stories to life, so subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next one. Disclaimer: this channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.